Okay, sorry for that interruption. I was saying that Vesalius has the same kind of wide ranging, inquisitive mind um, that makes a very good scientist. And he's also had very keen powers of observation and willing to trust those observations. That's what makes him very different, rather than just say, oh, here's the authoritative text. What I'm seeing, I probably can't trust because Galen has to be right, you know? Vesalius comes right out and said, completely Galen is completely wrong. And look for yourselves. Here it is. I've seen it with my eyes, and I'll illustrate it and I'll show you and prove to you. So let me talk a little bit about him as a person, also, where he comes from, and I think it'll kind of make sense how he turns out. He was born in Brussels, in what's now Belgium, in 1514, and was the son of one of the pharmacists of the Emperor Charles V, who was himself Flemish and also King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, and rules pretty much all of Europe in the 16th century. And moved around a lot. So I think his father, certainly a very cosmopolitan kind of person, but also very wealthy. And he decided he's going to give Vesalius the best university education he can possibly get in medicine. He might have gone into pharmacy too, but who knows? That's what his father did. But he encouraged him from a very young age. And it seems like, at least the stories that are told about Vesalius when he was young, is he was found sort of dissecting mice and doing, just like really, really an inquisitive mind. I don't know if any of those stories are true, but there's certainly things that were repeated about him. He went and got his undergraduate degree near home in Louvain. Um, Actually, I think even an MA there. That's a pretty conservative place at the time, but my reason for mentioning it is he learned not just great classical Latin there, but he learned Greek there also. So he's among those kind of medical humanists that can read Galen in the original text, and in fact anything in Greek. He also went to Paris to study, and this is at the time the most conservative, ultra Galenist university you could anywhere in Europe, really. And he becomes apprenticed to a guy who is an arch Galenist. This is Jacobus Silvius, who was, you know, I think like many people who we've discussed already, he believed dissection was useful only insofar as it illustrates the ideas of Galen. So Silvius is a really interesting figure. He's actually one of my authors also. I've written about him, and he's as Galenist as they come. And so naturally, Vesalius doesn't get along with him, okay? Because he's one of those guys with blinders on that you learn the text of Galen and you know everything, right? And I'm not sure why they didn't like each other. I find Silvius actually very congenial, but I think what happened is that Vesalius probably started to criticize the Galenic text. Silvius came to Galen's defense, and these guys just did not get along from the start. And very typical of Renaissance scholars, I know it's going to sound really weird, sometimes modern scholars do, but usually not this bad, they started calling each other names. And this sort of war of name calling in print started to flow out. Silvius called Vesalius Vesanus, which means a madman. It sounds like a much dirtier word to me, but in any case, that's what he called him. He said, "You are a purveyor of filth, sewage, a pimp, a liar, etc." And Vesalius said, you could learn more about anatomy in a butcher's shop than in any of Silvius's classes, because the guy is an idiot. And Silvius only knows how to use a knife in order to carve a steak and things of that nature. I don't need to go into more detail. You get the point. Anyway, the point is that Vesalius has to leave Paris as a result of this, without getting his degree. I don't know whether it was the controversy or the fact that a war actually broke out again between France and the Empire in 1536. So he's forced to go home. He's on the enemy side, right? Whatever it was, he ends up leaving there, and he shows up in Padua in fall of 1537, and they hand him an MD. Okay, and I don't know whether this is, great transfer of credits from one university to another. I don't know, or they were just so impressed with him that they said, "We need you as a medical doctor here," and gave him a degree on the spot. But they're actually, that's not an uncommon thing to happen. Erasmus showed up at places, and they often just handed him a PhD. It's not unlike an honorary degree in some respects, but in any case, that's where Vesalius gets his degree from. And he was appointed on the spot as a lecturer in anatomy and surgery. So the point is, he gets this university position as a physician, right? Not as a, he's not a lowly surgeon. He doesn't go through the, like most people do it. They get an apprenticeship, they learn, and then they patch up bodies and cut hair and pull teeth, whatever. But Padua is among the only places. Remember, Italy is that exception in universities. Is the place where physicians were expected to do dissections all the time. He apparently was a very popular teacher there. His students flocked to his lectures, and he was adored by them. And they gave him a raise, which is really kind of interesting. The more popular he became, the more cadavers he needed, of course, which is very difficult. Whether he told his students to do this or not, the story started circulating that when people would die, the day after they were buried, his students would go in and dig them up and do some grave robbing, especially criminals. You're hung from the gallows, no one's gonna. These are. In English, these are called resurrectionists. You get the idea that you rise again after dead, or sack 'em up men, as they would do the dirty work. And there's one story that I remember hearing about Vesalius's students who stole a corpse that was freshly buried, and they were trying to get him into the university, and so they dressed him up and they held him between their arms and they pretended he was drunk, and they walked him into the dissection theater, saying, "Oh, this guy had a little too much to drink today, but he'll be fine." And he was dead, obviously. So in any case, Vesalius actually did eventually make an official deal with the Paduan authorities to provide him with bodies, but it's a big problem, actually, and especially female bodies, because, I don't know why, but women don't seem to kill people as often as men, so they're not criminals. But I read one source that actually said Vesalius only had 6 women, cadavers, to dissect in these years, and some were very badly decayed, so they were basically just useful as skeletons. He did one very quick autopsy of a pregnant woman that had been murdered, but apart from that, he really doesn't have many women to work with. But so in any case, these years at the university, actually, let me show you. This is his dissection theater, and I want you to see what a strange illustration this is. Partly because there's the cadaver in the middle. There's also a skeleton you can see hanging up there, which would be used partly for illustration, but there's also like people under the table, kind of all over the place. I think there's a dog somewhere, there's a monkey here, which is hilarious. And of course there's people, even on the top looking down through the space. It looks like it's a very popular course, right? rather crowded. Which I find fascinating. But in any case, Vesalius, is the started to make these anatomical charts for his students. They're called the Tabulae Anatomicae Sex, which means 6 tables, anatomical tables, 1538. They're still Galenic, and in fact, there's one that even shows the Rete Mirabile and the 5-lobed liver. I mean, those are real Galenic mistakes, right? But what is strange is this is a fugitive sheet, so this comes out of the text itself. But if you look closely, I don't know why he's missing his genitals, but that's irrelevant. But what's really strange about this is that's Vesalius himself. He's being shown as the corpse being dissected, and there's various parts of him all over the place. I'm not sure why. That seems really bizarre to me, but in any case, that's him. But the point of this is that unlike earlier anatomy, but in fact, like Leonardo in some respects, is they depict the various systems and structures as if they're in a living body, moving. Um, an anatomy in motion, if you want to say that, rather than just a inert organ or a prone body lying there. He wants to show what people will look like as they're moving, and we'll see that's one of the revolutionary things about the Fabrica. Um, and he's doing it here in his very early teaching years, which I find really fascinating. And these, incidentally, Vesalius drew them himself, so they're not. This is not. This is not on the level of Leonardo by any means. They're actually very simple, and he's not a bad draftsman. They're actually pretty good. But we'll see that obviously his ideas are being put down onto paper. But we'll see when he gets a real artist, they're much more arresting. Now, what do you suppose would happen if you were doing dissection after dissection, trying to teach a lot of enthusiastic students that are eager to learn, trying as hard as they can to be good Galenists, but they're still like kind of asking a lot of questions, right? And I can imagine Galen going back into the faculty lounge and telling his fellow Galenists, physicians, professors, these students are just wearing me down. They keep having questions. I keep seeing things that are not in the text, and it's driving me crazy. Could it be that Galen is wrong? That there's mistakes that he made? Because every time we cut open a skull, the students say, "Oh, where's that rete mirabile that we read about?" I think Vesalius kind of starts to suspect. Where is it? Why is it? Could it be that Galen was actually using an ox, which does have that weird net, that wonderful net that's around the brain? Could it be that it's really just not in the human brain? It's not evaporating the minute it hits the air, as someone suggested. Could it be that Galen might not ever have used a human as a subject, as a dissection subject? So Vesalius starts to get a lot more critical of Galen, and I think it was his students that kind of prompted him into that position. So by the time we get to the 1540s, eventually he does actually come to that conclusion that Galen had never used a human, ever used a human. Okay, it wasn't that he'd sometimes used apes and sometimes used other animals, that he had never done it. And so I think Vesalius comes to the conclusion that if that's the case, we need to look at everything anew. We need to look for ourselves and record what's really there and not make these mistakes, because they might actually be really fatal, right? If a surgeon is using this anatomical knowledge that's incorrect and then applying it to, cutting open a body and making a big mistake because he doesn't really know what's in there. So after several years of doing this, questioning, he finally said, I have enough information now to really give you the truth about human anatomy. This is 1543 again. This is published in Basel by a very important printer called Operinus, who Operinus had called Paracelsus an idiot. That's something that struck me right here. But in any case, that's when the Fabrica comes out after 5 years of work. And it is very easy to be dazzled by the beauty of the woodcuts. They're really dazzling. Now I'm thinking, are they woodcuts or are they engravings? I'm not quite sure, but in any case, they are in all of these sort of remarkable classical poses. The aesthetic of them is very much of that period, which is Mannerist. The Renaissance is actually, in terms of artistic styles, has come to an end by this point. But the aesthetics are such that the figures, especially the women, have very small heads, very wide middles, and very tiny feet. They kind of look like peacocks. In fact, that's sort of the Mannerist aesthetics of the late 16th century. But the importance of the work is, apart from the stylistic beauty of it, is that there is an extensive text accompanying the illustrations, which are numbered and lettered, so you can look at the part, look at the text that explains it, and then every single detail of the people in motion, in striking these dramatic poses often, which is strange, so that anyone can look at it and figure out exactly where a muscle or a bone or a tendon or whatever it might be. And they also show how the whole dissection proceeds. Where you start, the parts you take off as you're exposing, stripping down the body, basically, in order to get to the skeleton at the end. And it is all human anatomy, right? There's no animals here. There's no, and it totally, throughout the book criticizes Galen. It also becomes very popular, which is kind of weird. You think, like, what? Why ordinary people want to read this? So they actually came out with a smaller, condensed version called the epitome, or epitome, like sort of the concentrated version that has the illustrations and a simplified text that's cheap, that people can buy. And I think that's sort of a key to why this became so revolutionary, is that it anyone can just buy it and look and see for themselves. And I think that the illustrations are the main attraction. They're done by this guy named Stephen of Calcar, who was a pupil of Titian. So it's a great artist. And I think the other amazing thing about this text is that Vesalius insists that people do the dissections themselves, right? Don't just look at this text and trust my word for all the details. I want you to do everything yourself, and obviously gives a medical student all the information they might need, but doesn't say, trust me, I know, and don't look for yourself. So I'm going to show you some of these, and it's going to be a little tricky because I've got overhead transparencies, but let me just show you these, how stunning these are. They're in no particular order, okay? This is the table of instruments which you've got to master in order to be an anatomist. This is a body you can see stripped down to some muscles. He's gruesomely holding his own head, which is sort of grotesque, I know. And you can see this, parts, the muscles are entirely stripped off, and in other parts they're still on. But if you follow the order that's in the original, he actually goes from from the whole body down to the end. Let me find some more of these. Oh, here. So this is the first one, and here you can see the very stylized mannerist kind of painting. There's the guy. I don't think they're actually very much in mannerist proportions, so it's not. This is kind of an idealized body, and if you'll see the woman there, I mean, I guess you could really have a body that looked like that, but she's kind of, peacock-like, little head and tiny little feet and wide middle. But that was the aesthetic of the period. So in any case, he wants to show you those so that when you go deeper and deeper in, you'll get a sense of what the body looks like. So this is a famous kind of muscle man that comes from him, and notice there's like little classical ruins around, and he's sort of gesturing up towards the heavens. It's a really fascinating depictions here. There you can see the little places where they're marked with letters, so you can see exactly where every muscle is, how they connect. And you can see here he's taken out one muscle and pulled it down, and look at these sort of weird facial gesture, expressions on the corpse itself, which is, I find them freakishly interesting. I don't know whether I'd want to have these in my house or anything, but there's the back, and you can see that he's gesturing, right? So this is intended to be in motion. There's more muscles all labeled, and so you can use it for easy reference. Here's another one where again, muscles. If I'd put these in order, you'd see that it's gradually strips away the guy until he's finally just a skeleton. That's the way they would hang him up as they were doing the dissection, right? So he's strung up by a rope, and all of his guts have been removed. His whole thoracic cavity is empty. You can see some bones. Isn't this weird? I mean, like, there's a little village back there, and here's this guy standing with his muscles being stripped off of his body. And then finally, the this pathetic kind of figure longing and looking up toward the sky, and finally this real Memento Mori, the skeleton contemplating his own death while he's in skeletal form. I find that really, really strange and bizarre, because in fact there's one of them, oh here it is, where he's actually there with with a skull, sort of contemplating the nature of existence, and he's just a skeleton at that point. A memento mori, incidentally, means a reminder of death. And he is with a crutch, an old man, so kind of gesturing and remember death and follow me. Weird. It's really, I find them freakish. But in any case, this was a way for students to learn anatomy, effectively, I think. And the key to it is, observation over authority. A new kind of, let's give you a big fancy Greek word, epistemology. Okay, that means how you know things is knowledge gained from looking at other authorities. Here's the change in epistemology, is that knowledge is gained through experience, through empirical evidence. Empirical means through your senses, right? And doesn't come that the ancient texts are useless, basically, or they shouldn't be trusted. You should trust what you can see and hear, and of course that's the way we think as modern people and modern scientists. And some of the specifics that proved Vesalius's new methodology are. Some of the things that he proved are that the sternum has 3 segments. Look closely. It's not there, not 7. The mandible isn't made of 2 separate bones. If you look closely, it's, your whole jawbone is 1. He apparently also did a little experiment on the heart to see if there was any truth to that idea of Galen's, that there are invisible pores in the septum, in the dividing chamber in the heart, that blood could pass through. And he said, well, let's see, can you pass a bristle through the center? No. If you take a heart and you put liquid in one chamber and then squeeze that, will it seep through to the other chamber through that middle septum? No. There's no way blood goes through that. He said it's got to be a circuit. Well, he doesn't figure that out quite yet. We're not at Harvey yet, but it's he says Galen's wrong here. There's just no way, and he proves this to an audience as they're watching him. But it's a kind of crucial step in scientific advancement, because the students then have to rethink the whole thing, and we'll see there is actually a direct line that goes from Vesalius to some of his students to Harvey, who proves the circulation of blood. We won't get there for another week or so, but for the time being, most of Vesalius's ideas about physiology are Galenic, as I've said. He believed there are still 2 separate vascular systems. Veins and arteries don't connect. And in lots of ways, the stuff that he is not directly concerned with, it's non-anatomical, are still full of mistakes. And it really takes his students, interestingly, the importance of students not just carrying on your work, but like kind of being inspired by this new epistemology. They carry his work much further. So let me just mention one thing before I get on to his followers, is the Fabrica caused a lot of controversy at the time. It attacked the medical establishment at the time, and of course they don't like to be attacked, right? They don't want to be criticized. And I think what happened is Vesalius is sort of tossed into this middle of this enormous controversy, and he doesn't want it. He doesn't like the publicity. He's really a kind of, not a recluse, but he doesn't want to be notorious for doing this. So he actually gave up his university post. He's about in his early 30s, I think. He'd only taught for, maybe 5 or 6 years, I don't know. But he took a job as court physician to Charles V. It's a great position to have. It's comparable to Galen's in a way, right? To the emperor. And he spent the rest of his life basically tending to the petty complaints of courtiers who might be suffering gout or having a cold or some, ridiculous complaint. Who knows? It was very lucrative. He becomes very wealthy, but there's no real record of him doing much else. Not writing. He didn't take the opportunity to continue his research. But very oddly, he stops writing and just says, "All right, I'm done. I don't want this publicity. I'm just gonna, collect my salary and heal whoever needs to at court. But that's it." He was also, there's an interesting anecdote just occurs to me that he was there when Ambrose Paré, remember the surgeon, when he's there with Paré when Henry II was jousting and got a lance into his eye, and apparently the story, at least as I've heard it, was that he did some tests on the heads of 4 decapitated criminals, just poking them with the same lance to see what would happen to Henry, and Vesalius concludes there's no way he can survive this. It had gone through his eye into his brain, and if you pull it out, he's going to bleed to death. And Henry did, of course, die as a result of this. So the lesson is, don't joust. Even if you have Vesalius around to prove it, you're going to die anyway with a lance in the eye. So in any case, what's even weirder about Vesalius is he disappears in history. Apparently he ended his life going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and never made it home. Died on the way back at about 50 years old. So he was, it's a weird career. And I'm just thinking about this because I started teaching about the same time he did, in my late 20s. And I'm older than he was when he died. But I've been doing this for a really long time. He didn't. He just gave up, which is, I always wonder, what would have happened had he kept up his research. But in any case, his students do. And Vesalius's followers, some of them aren't exactly followers, they're sometimes contemporaries, but they're certainly inspired by him. The first was actually a rival. He's not a student at all, but a guy working in Rome whose name you might recognize is Bartolomeo Eustaquio. Okay, think of that name, Eustaquio. Dates are 1500 to 1574. Very similar to this group of people, very typical of this group of people who followed Vesalius, because he said, I don't have time to do the entire body, but I'm going to focus on one particular system, get it really right, and figure everything out, rather than the whole. So you can guess Eustaquio in Italian, Eustachian is the way we pronounce it in English. He worked on the ears. And actually many of his works are actually gone, and his illustrations lost. Most of them are published after his death, but I think it's fair to say that when he was publishing, he was maybe even as famous as Vesalius. Even though he doesn't do the whole body, he becomes famous, and the Eustachian tubes in the ear are named for him. That's not all he did. He also wrote a work on the kidneys, I think he certainly surpasses Vesalius in that respect. Vesalius still thought that the kidney was like a sieve, that comes from Galen, really. And Eustaquio says it's not at all. He did some work on the venous system, on the nervous system, so it's kind of like the weak spots in Vesalius's theory. Eustaquio finishes and gives us really detailed description of the ossicles, those little bones inside the ear, and the tympanum, and things that are tiny parts, hundreds of little bones in your ears, apparently. And the tubes, the Eustachian tubes, are named for him. That's Eustacio, if you want to spell it. Another figure who's also at Padua, who actually replaces Vesalius when he leaves. This is Realdus Columbus, just like, spelled the same way as Christopher Columbus. They're not related, as far as I know. 1516 to 1509 are his dates. Another person who corrects some of the errors of Vesalius, provoked a little controversy, in fact, between them, but his major contribution was showing that the lens is not actually at the center of the eye. He did work on the eye. He also did some work on the peritoneum, and apparently gives us the term pelvis in its modern usage, that for that bone. Okay, so also he's one of the figures who picks up the experiments to try and figure out how the heart works. Which way does the blood flow? If it's not sloshing back and forth, how does it get from, say, the heart to the lungs? And he shows that there is this minor circulation that goes from the heart to the lungs. That something is happening there that is opposite from the heart to the body. So that's important because it continues the work that Vesalius kind of starts and then continues through a student of his, Fabricius Aquapendente, and Harvey goes to Padua and studies with him. So there's a real thread from Vesalius through Columbus all the way to discovery of the circulation. So Columbus is also important. The third follower, there are a lot more. I'm just mentioning the ones who were interesting. The third one is Gabriella Fallopian, and you can probably figure out what his specialty was, right? 1523 to 62, he succeeded Columbus in the chair at Padua, and his specialty, of course, was the reproductive urogenital systems. His anatomical observations of 1561 have descriptions of tubes inside the female, connected to the female womb, which are named for him the fallopian tubes. Okay? He also seems to have named most of the features in the female reproductive system that we still use today. And in fact, something really weird, he gives the, I'm pretty sure he decided, he named the placenta, which is really kind of odd, because if you think about that word, it means, it seems to be in Latin connected to the word flat. Placunta means a flat pancake in Greek, and the word placenta in Latin originally just meant a flat pancake. If you ever seen a placenta, it looks exactly like a dark, bloody, flat pancake. So that's a weird sort of term that we use from him. And there are a lot of sort of weird etymological things that happen in this period in Neo-Latin that are kind of come from the these people trying to make up new terms. The one that perplexes me the most, and I don't know where they got this word, but the word vagina in Latin is means a sheath, a little sheath, like you'd have your sword in, which seems like, what the hell were they thinking of when they named it that? But it's cognate with the word vainilla, which means in Spanish a little sheath, if you look at a vanilla bean. So those two words are etymologically the same. Bizarre, isn't it? God, you gotta love language. You couldn't make this stuff up. But in any case, back to Fallopian, the most interesting discovery of his and importance for our story is the so-called, he named this part the clitoris and described what it's for. I don't think he discovered it. I think obviously people knew it was there, I hope. But he's the one who anatomically described it and its function. So he's just a very interesting person in terms of female anatomy, which doesn't get a lot of attention before this, believe it or not, strangely. And I think, why is Fallopian so important here? Think back to when we were discussing female and male anatomy as inverted forms of each other. That's an idea that comes out of Galen, right? By doing this extraordinarily detailed anatomy, Fallopian shows that they are not the same structure at all. They're actually not even analogous. They're completely different. The plumbing does not work the same way in both. And why that's important is the entire kind of anatomical, physiological argument for gender difference, taken from Galen again, hinges on this point that one is an innie, one's an outie, one's completely cooked, as it were, in the womb, and the other is incomplete and cold. But if you take that idea, men are complete and full and hairy and smart and everything, and women are defective because of their anatomy, this discovery suggests it's complete nonsense. It can't be true because they're not analogous. They have nothing to do with each other. They are, so you can't argue female inferiority based on biology anymore. Okay, Fallopia, I know that sounds kind of confusing, but it means that the whole argument for female inferiority based on anatomy is now tossed out the window by Fallopio's discovery. Um, and of course, that kind of misogyny doesn't disappear, but they have to use other arguments to replace it, right? Theological ones, social ones, but the ideas of gender really quite interesting. Another thing, and this is I'm only finding out about this stuff because I'm writing about aphrodisiacs right now. So it's a very weird topic. It's hard not to be distracted by it. But in any case, Fallopio apparently in his book De Morbo Gallico, which is about syphilis, gives the first description of the condom, which is, I did not know that until recently. The name of that thing is named after a doctor who worked for Charles II of England. But they are invented right in this period, amazingly enough. So what else am I talking about? So one of the other effects of Vesalius's inspiration is a whole new set of comparative anatomists as well. And I'm not going to go into them, but once the human is done, people say, oh, well, why aren't we doing other mammals? Why aren't we doing fish? There's a whole school of ichthyologists. Rondelet is one of them. Why aren't we doing bugs? Thomas Muffet is one of those guys who's a, what would you call him? An arachnidologist. And if you know the rhyme, little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet and eating her curds and whey, and along came a spider who sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away. Well, her dad, little Mr. Thomas Muffet, was a spider scientist and wrote this poem apparently about his daughter eating her cheese in a bowl and being frightened by a spider. Weird, isn't it? So, well, Muffet was a real physician, wrote a great dietary also. So in any case, why am I mentioning all this? Zoology, scientific zoology and anatomy of animals is born right here. Not our topic, but I just want to mention it. Now let me also kind of change topics here for a moment to discuss one of the most fascinating figures in the entire period. He is central to the art of surgery in the 16th century, and I think really a figure who's just fascinating in so many ways. This is a Frenchman. His name is Ambrose Paré, P-A-R-E. Okay? Dates are 1510 to 1590, and I think he's another one of these characters who thinks independently, very ambitious, impetuous, very original also in many ways. And unlike the other people who have been discussing, he is honest enough to admit that not all of his breakthroughs are so original. He got ideas from other places. He gives credit where it's due, which I think is an honorable thing. And like Vesalius, he bases his findings on direct observations, period. Okay? Trial and error, seeing what works, and he is one of those people who doesn't have all the theoretical baggage that comes with a university education. Unlike Vesalius, Paré was low-born and couldn't speak Latin. And I know this sounds weird, but I think that's an advantage, like it was for Leonardo. He never went to a university, never got a degree there. He was basically just one of these craftsman surgeons that I've been talking about, who just happened to luck out that there was a big demand for works on surgery in the vernacular. Printing, of course, is absolutely central to why this text catches on. The technology, I think the other very important thing, Paré kind of lucks out in that he's the first major writer to get an enormous wealth of practical experience from treating hundreds upon hundreds of injured bodies, which were the casualty of the French wars of religion, which take place in the latter 16th century. He was an army surgeon, okay, hired by the state to patch up people who were not just your typical sword wounds, arrow points, lances in various places, but something else is very different about 16th century warfare is guns. Okay, that's the turning point. They're invented earlier, but this is the point where men can actually go into battle with a gun, shoot, and cannon also, I should mention, and they are used extensively in the battlefield. Um, Muskets are invented. The arquebus, which is the has a wide bell on the end, sort of you picture like the thing that they're shooting at Thanksgiving, right? That's not for shooting your turkey, incidentally. You fill it with with small shot, and it goes poof, and it splatters all over the place. Now, no one has had experience of treating gunshot wounds, right? Um, Especially if you get riddled with gunshot wounds, you got to get the lead out, right? Um, and really no one has written about them much. And it seems even the early writing about gunshot wounds, they're classified along with poisons like snake bites, because of course you do get infected, right? And the lead will poison you and kill you. But the way that they normally did this was like a lot of other wounds, they would use cauterization, right? So you have a hot iron. Let's imagine you have a gunshot wound in your arm. You pull that ball out, you go pss, with a hot iron and close off the wound. Now the thing is, that's never ever going to heal, right? It'll stop the bleeding, you won't bleed to death, but you'll have a permanent scar and permanent red, open, burnt tissue there forever, okay? Now what's weird is that if you have a straight shot, then that's clear. It'll go into your body, maybe out the other side, but it'll leave a hole, you know, where you can pull the thing out. That's not the way bullets actually hit your body. They hit the bone, they ricochet all over the place. They cause sort of flesh to be ripped apart also. So that all these sort of nooks and crannies that are filled with little bits of lead shot, they often don't stay whole either. Once they hit your bone, they shatter. And the standard procedure for this was because you couldn't cauterize the end of it, right? Because it's got all this ripped stuff, is they would pour boiling oil onto the wound, and it would seep into the holes, little places, and sort of sear it closed, right? If that doesn't sound horrible, I don't know what does. So Paré started his career as an army surgeon, and he was doing this, you know, this typical standard boiling oil into the gunshot wounds, until one day he just ran out of the oil. And he says, oh no, what am I going to do? I guess I've got to try something else. So he made a dressing, you know, when you dress a wound, that's made of eggs and turpentine and oil of roses. It sounds weird. It sounds like a salad dressing, right? No, it's not. It's the turpentine obviously is going to be a disinfectant. The eggs is going to prevent the oxygen from getting into it and infection, right? But he covers this thing up with bandages, and he says, I'm just going to hope for the best. I can't cauterize it because we're out of the boiling oil. And what he noticed was this worked better. It actually healed much quicker, far more neat. The recoveries were more efficient. And it struck him at that moment that sometimes you find things out of complete desperation, and through your experience, you should learn from them, right? There's no reason to follow traditional methods. If you happen to stumble on something new, use it. If it works, use it. Like, when have we heard that? A long time, right? And sometimes the theoretically based treatment will not be as effective as just something you stumble on by accident. And I think, again, if he were following the letter of the book and following standard procedure for difficult wounds through staunching the blood through cauterization, he would never have discovered this. And of course, he writes about this in vernacular, in French, recommending that other people stop using boiling oil and start using a disinfectant dressing. Okay, he doesn't know about infection yet, of course, but that's what's happening there. And all sorts of concoctions he made gained him a lot of fame. He invented another treatment for serious burns. That's another one of his great moments of fame, is, you know, treating burns that I think they use raw onions. I'm not sure what that would do, but and then there's also a well, you know, I just thought, as long as I'm talking about Paré, let me look at the text and see what these recipes really that made him famous are really like. So I found one that I'm going to read to you. It is for puppy oil balm. Okay, so cook 2 newly born puppies in oil of lilies until the bones dissolve. Mix with turpentine, a pound of earthworms, and cook over a slow fire. and this supposedly you'd put onto a balm onto pains, and it would promote healing. Okay, just that was I included that just so you don't think he's discovering all these wonderful modern medicines. Not We're not there yet. Okay. But in any case, my point is that on the battlefield you have to deal with serious injuries, and sometimes they require amputation, right? I mean, if a leg is blown to bits, you've got to, you don't have anesthetics of any kind, really. Basically, you've got to tie the patient down to a chair and then saw the leg off, right? There's no other way to do it. In fact, let me show you. This is a typical depiction of that from Walter Riff, a book on surgery. You can see the guy is, poor guy, he's blindfolded. He's having someone, I think, is he reading a text to him or something? Yeah, he's putting his hand on his head steady, and they're just sawing his leg off, right? And it's obviously got some ligatures here with a, I think, a kind of tourniquet to prevent him bleeding out, but certainly that's the way you do it. And if you're on the battlefield, of course, it will be far less tidy, right? Of course, the patient will die, often just from sheer shock. So the way you would stop the blood after this happens is cauterizing it, right? You burn the end with a hot iron. But of course, that's going to leave a raw stump for the rest of that person's life if they survive. And there's no way the skin can grow back because it's seared off. So Paré says, wait, why are we doing this? Why are we cauterizing when you could actually extend the flap of skin that goes below where you're cutting off, like keep an empty pocket there and save the skin around there and sew the skin back together instead of cauterizing. You leave the ligature on for a while to stop the blood flow, and then you sew that wound closed, and the skin will actually rebind itself, right? It'll reconnect, and eventually it'll heal. You won't have the leg back, but at least you won't have this raw stump. And Paré said, well, at that point, then you just add a wooden leg to the bottom, and that person will be able to walk again. And then he actually invented all sorts of contraptions for people with missing limbs. So how did he figure this stuff out? By not trusting the authorities, by just doing what he thought would work well, trying it out, testing it, and then finally figuring out that they actually work. And actually, luckily, Paré figured out this procedure before an unfortunate accident of his own. This happened in 1561. He was kicked by a horse and broke 2 bones in his left leg. And that's something that could normally be easily reset, except that he actually imagine him stepping backwards so he wasn't kicked by the horse again. And then he fell backwards, but his boots stayed upright. So imagine like this, and then the bones actually broke through the skin, through his boot, in fact, and he was laying there with his boots upright and his femurs, whatever the bones were, not femurs, the lower leg, piercing through the flesh and boot. And he described this. So it's a compound fracture, okay? And the usual method here is you just hack that off, right? There's no way that can be repaired. And Paré thought, well, I might as well try. I'm here. I'm a physician. I know how to do this. He reset the bones himself, put them back in place, dressed the wound himself, and could not find anything to close off the wound. So he used egg whites, flour, and melted butter, which again sounds like a recipe for cookies, but in any case, he used that, and lo and behold, bandaged it, put a splint around it himself, and kept sort of caring for it very, very conscientiously, and lived another 30 years and walked again, which is amazing that he was able to do that. Bizarre story, isn't it? Another interesting story that will give you some kind of insight into Ambrose Paré and his very critical, empirical attitude is he became famous, interestingly, got contacts among nobles and royalty. So the son of that unfortunate Henry II, who I mentioned, who got the lance in his eye, this is Charles IX, King of France, was a bit of a quack and very strange, but he was wondering, he got this gift of a bezoar. Okay, now if you don't know what a bezoar is, it's a calcified bit of matter kind of like a hairball that you find in the stomach of goats. I know, really. You polish it up, and then it's supposed to have miraculous powers, shaved or crumbled up and put into medicines. And in fact, of all bizarre things, the last time I was in Hong Kong, I went into a pharmacy just out of idle curiosity. There in the case were a handful of bezoars. Unbelievable. I didn't think they still existed, but they do, apparently in China. So in any case, oh, and I should mention, you know who else gets bezoars are llamas. Monards, who we mentioned last time, got a bezoar from Peru in the 1560s and thought this is going to be wonderful. But usually they come from the east. They come from Persia, actually. And they're supposed to be a wonderful antidote to poison, which is why rulers love them, because they're always afraid of being poisoned, right? They work against scorpion stings. They're good against plague, a whole slew of diseases. So in any case, the new fashion is these cool American bezoars. And Charles the Ninth, the king, gets one of these, and he says, "Oh, Pare, can you tell me, do these really work? I want you to find out for me. I've been told they do, but..." Pare tells him, I don't know. Honestly, there's only one way to really find out. That's to run an experiment, to try it out for yourself. And then the king probably wonders, well, how can we run an experiment? And he says, well, we have to find a human, give him poison, then give him the bezoar and see if he survives, right? They did it. They found a criminal who was sentenced to death. It's actually one of the king's cooks, which I find really amazing. He was stealing silver plates, and the punishment was death. And they told him, okay, we're going to hang you. You're going to die, certainly. No doubt about that. You're definitely going to be dead. But we'll give you a chance to survive. We'll give you some poison, then give you the bezoar, and if you survive, you're free to go home. That's it. You have a chance to live. And of course the guy agrees, and who wouldn't? And the court apothecary mixed up this poison. It was mercuric chloride, which is a corrosive sublimate that I'm imagining if you drank would sear right through your tongue, right through your throat, burn a hole in your stomach, and kill you in a few minutes. But in any case, they gave him this stuff. They gave him the bezoar. As you can imagine, what happened? He died, and Pare says, bezoars are a phony. don't value it. Certainly don't take it. And this is, I guess, let's put it this way. There were a lot of miraculous drugs floating around that people had a lot of faith in, and they are debunked in this period. My favorite one is actually the unicorn horn, which you carry around with you when you're traveling, and you drink out of it, and it prevents illness. And they're very expensive, of course, because a unicorn can only be approached by a beautiful young virgin. You're wondering, like, what is this man talking about? Unicorns they do really exist. No, they don't exist. But what they're using is a narwhal horn, which twists around, and long, narrow thing that's hollow. So you can, people found them and said, unicorn horn. Let's use this. It's an antidote to poison. So that's one of the things that are debunked. Another one is, I think mummy is also debunked. Mummia is a powdered mummy. Actually, it's a human body that's powdered up, and you take that as a poison, and apparently it creates longevity and everything. That's actually still used well into the 19th century, so I don't know how well debunked it was. But in any case, these kind of remedies disappear, and Pare is one of those to systematically question their validity, to test them on living subjects. Not that he doesn't have his own wacko crazy remedies like the puppy balm, but they begin to disappear. And the larger lesson to be learned here is, like Vesalius, the importance of Pare is direct sensory observation, empirical evidence, experiment, and proving what you say, not just claiming, I think maybe this is the case, right? And it begins the long revision and overturning of the entire medical system, the entire humoral physiological system that's been in reign for 2 millennia now begins to come apart. Okay, now what are we missing? Why isn't this the scientific revolution that we're going to talk about in the next century? We're missing a methodology, a scientific method. We'll talk about that. We're missing a lot of instruments that will be very, very crucial. microscopes for one. We're not there yet, but ways to measure things, and of course ways to quantifying matter and quantifying physiology is also very important. So we'll talk about that a couple of lectures down. But next time we're going to get to a figure who is really one of the wackiest and craziest and most fascinating, the father of modern chemistry, some claim, father of modern pharmaceutical chemistry, I should say, and that's Paracelsus. I'll see you back here in YouTube next time.